Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the newest episode of the Thinking Jew podcast, where we dive deep into Torah and Judaism, always uncovering new layers of depth we did not realize was there beforehand. I'm your host, Rabbi Moshe Siegel from Richardson, Texas, and as always, I would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, future topic requests. You can always reach me at thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com. In today's episode, I want to discuss a fascinating discussion that happens in the very beginning of this week's Torah portion. It's really a continuation. In the end of last week's Torah portion, God sends Moses to speak to Pharaoh and to tell him to set the Jews free. Moses goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh not only doesn't let them free, but he intensifies the slavery and he makes it even harder for the Jews. Moses is seemingly bothered by this. He comes back to God at the end of last week's Torah portion, and he says, God, why did you send me? Ever since you sent me, things got so much worse. This week's Torah portion, the Torah portion of Va'eirah, begins with God's response to Moses. Rashi explains this was God giving rebuke to Moses for complaining that Hashem made it harder on the Jews. So I want to read these verses inside and explain them. And just as a point of reference before we start, there's a lot of different names of God mentioned in these two verses. We're in chapter 6, verse 2 and 3. And out of reverence and respect for Hashem, we never say the name of Hashem as it's written for no reason unless we're praying or saying blessings. Additionally, the Gemara says we're not even allowed to speak out the letters of Hashem's name. We're not allowed to spell Hashem's names with its letters. It's called the Hoga Shemos Bo'siosav. We're prohibited from even doing that. So a lot of times we'll say, for example, Elohim, which even though if you look in the Hebrew, it's really a hey. It really ends with him. But we'll say Kim in order to show respect for the name. As well as the name Havaya, that's really switching around the letters of the name. The name really starts with a Y sound in the beginning. But in order to not say the name, we're going to switch that to Havaya. So if you look at the verses inside, you'll understand exactly what the names are. But I'll just translate them as best as I can through audio. So if you look in chapter 6, verse 2, it says as follows. God is responding to Moses complaining that he made things harder for the Jews. And it says, and Elohim spoke to Moses, and he said, I am Havaya, and I appeared to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as Kel Shakai. But the name of Havaya, I did not make myself known to them. So it's a very strange few verses. It seems like a big name game. It's saying Hashem appears as Elohim, but as soon as he says that, he says, who am I? Even though I'm appearing as Elohim, I am Hashem. But your fathers, they knew me by the name of Kel Shakai. They didn't know this name of Hashem. They didn't know this name of Havaya. Okay, so to first understand, we know Judaism was actually what introduced monotheism. Judaism obviously believes in one God. So why does this one God have to have so many different names? And what do these names represent? So the truth is, if you look in all of the deeper sources, they all explain that God actually has no name. There's actually no name and no concept, no word that we can use to express Hashem's essence. Hashem's true essence is completely beyond anything in human comprehension. Even the greatest Kabbalists, even Moses, no one is ever able to understand God's essence, and therefore nobody can identify it and give it a name. So when we attribute these names to Hashem, when we attribute different names to God, in essence what we're really doing is we're identifying certain expressions that Hashem has in this world, certain pathways that we can understand Him, and we'll refer to those specific ideas and we'll give those ideas a name in order to understand we're referring to God as being the most powerful concept in the world, or as a compassionate being, or as an understanding being, or as a powerful, as a just being. All these names are to express a certain attribute of God, but there are no names we have that represent the actual true essence of what God is. That's completely beyond human comprehension. The closest name we have to the name of essence of God, the Rosh writes, and again, as always, the primary sources that I quote in these podcasts are all sourced in the podcast episode details if you want to see any of them inside. The Rosh teaches us that the closest name we have to God's essence is what we refer to as the tetragrammaton, or Yud K, Vav K, the name of Havaya. And beyond that, all the other names are lower level names, and they're all just expressions of certain aspects of Hashem. So let's get into it. What exactly are these names? Why is Elohim talking? Why is he saying he is Hashem? And what does it mean that he appeared to the forefathers as Kel Shakai? So to begin to understand this nuance of difference between the way that Hashem expresses himself to the Jewish nation in Egypt and the way he expressed himself to our forefathers, we have to understand the fundamental difference in relationship that our forefathers had with God versus the entire Jewish nation represented by Moses in this conversation with God. The role of our forefathers was to form the perfect spiritual makeup that will eventually allow the Jewish nation to exist as God's nation in the world. Meaning the forefathers themselves were not there to accomplish this mission. They were there to lay the groundwork to create the foundation that at a later time will be expressed by their children in the world in the greatest way possible. In Rabbi Lazaro, the great Kabbalist Rabbi Moshe, in his expression, he calls the avos the shrushim, the roots. Similar to the roots that produce the tree, the Jewish nation is the tree that comes out, and our forefathers were the roots. I think another modern day example to really understand what this means is think of the forefathers as the spiritual DNA of the Jewish nation. A child receives half of his DNA from his father and half of his DNA from his mother. Depending on how that genome reads, will vastly impact and change different physical, emotional, mental, so many different aspects of the child that are all dependent on this child's DNA he receives from his parents. Often in ways that the parents might themselves have not even known about. I take a little bit of a harsher example here, but imagine there's certain genetic diseases that the father might be a carrier for, the mother might be a carrier for, and they'll suffer no ill effects of it because they're just carriers and doesn't express themselves in the parents. But when these two parents come together and have a child, and the child now has this disease from both sides, the disease will express itself in the child. How did it get to the child? It's just expressing that which was latent and existent in the mother and the father the whole time. The parents are what allowed it to come into existence, here in the negative sense, but where it actually comes into existence is by their child. The same thing is true with our forefathers. Our forefathers' role was to set up such a deep connection with Hashem and to create such a binding relationship between Hashem, between God and the Jewish people, that it will be able to express itself later with a Mount Sinai experience, that it'll be able to express itself later with building a house in the physical world that can hold the Shekhinah, that the divine presence can reside in this world, in the tabernacle and eventually in the temple, that the Jews will be able to live in a higher spiritual level. All of that was put into our DNA by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but none of it expressed itself in their lifetime. It was just part of the spiritual genome that they themselves wrote. As an aside, those of you that are familiar with the concept of Maisa, avos, siman, libonim, there's a concept in Torah thought throughout Genesis that the actions, the stories that happened to our forefathers are foreshadowing or foretelling what's going to happen to their children in later years, later generations. The deeper understanding of this is that it's not just history repeating itself, but it's much deeper than that. It's the DNA. The stories of our forefathers are our DNA. So that will, by definition, express itself at some time in the future. So the more the understanding we have of our DNA, the more we can understand how it's going to express itself later in the future. So the basic role of the forefathers was they needed to nurture and create this deep connection to Hashem in the physical world through discovering and recognizing Hashem's existence in the world they lived in, connecting Hashem in a deep experiential way to normal, ordinary happenings in this world, that they made Hashem just a part of life. So all the stories the Torah tells us about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they often seem very ordinary. They don't seem like these deep spiritual, transcendent examples. What happened to them? They had Pharaoh stealing their wives, Avimelech stole Isaac's wife, the Philistines stole Isaac's wells, Jacob gets tricked by his father-in-law. All of these stories, Dinah gets raped by Shechem. All of these stories, they regular stories that are happening in the everyday occurrence of the world. But our forefathers are attaching deeply and connecting to Hashem through all of these stories. This is the attribute of Kel Shakai. Hashem is telling Moshe, your fathers only knew me through the physical world. Kel Shakai refers to God as the sustainer and provider of the world, like a mother who sustains her child by nursing and feeding him. It's a connection of sustenance through the physical world. What Hashem was about to do in Egypt, starting right after this conversation, was on a totally different level. He was about to turn water into blood, bring wild animals, locusts, boils, firstborns dying, darkness, completely turn the natural world upside down, explicitly revealing his true mastery and transcendence over the physical world. That's what the name of Havaya refers to. On the most basic level, it refers to Hashem being the one constant in the world, and the whole world is just an expression of Hashem's continuous will that wants it to run that way. So in essence, what God is really telling Moses is, listen, I understand the Jews weren't freed yet, but I have a plan. God in that moment reveals himself to Moses as what? As Elohim. What is Elohim? Elohim has the same numerical value as Hateva. Elohim is another, different than Kel Shakai, but another representation of the natural world. If you look in the first chapter of Genesis, all of creation happens with the name of Elohim. Bereshis bara Elohim es hashamayim ves haaretz. The whole chapter 1 only uses the name Elohim. In all of the creation of the physical world, Elohim is the name that creates it, and Elohim refers to Hashem as the one who creates nature. And this God, who's expressing himself in a natural way, is telling Moses, you're seeing me now as Elohim. You still have these questions of why didn't I free the Jews yet? You're still existing in the natural world. But you should know, I'm not really Elohim. I'm really Havaya. I'm really Hashem who is sending you. I'm really the God that can turn everything upside down in a split second. He was rebuking Moses and he was saying, your forefathers lived their whole lives only being able to relate to me as Kel Shakai, only knowing me through the natural world. And they never once questioned, I know this Havaya, where are you? Why aren't I able to see this expression of it? They knew that it would come out and it would express itself eventually. They had faith. So Moses, you're about to experience this. You're about to see what I'm going to do to Egypt. Don't ask these questions of why I sent you. You should know and recognize, like your forefathers before you, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that it's Havaya that's sending you. It's Hashem that's sending you, as you'll shortly experience yourself in a very real, tangible way. So that's, I think, the basic idea of the first few verses in this week's Parsha, the concept of the various names of Hashem and what they represent. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Thinking Jew podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you have any questions, comments, you can always reach me at thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com. I hope you have an amazing Shabbos.